time to start. My name's Emmett McGroarty. I'm with American Principles Project, and I'm here on this quick discussion of Common Core with Neil McCluskey from Cato Institute. So this is short. I just want to touch on a few things and then turn it over to Neil to touch on a few things, and then I think we'll open it up for questions. In my view, perhaps more so than any other issue, the Common Core exposes the growing rift between the political elitists and the people. And with regard to Republican politicians, since we're at CPAC, let's focus on Republicans. There is a tendency to discount the concerns of citizens in favor of the views of the corporate, bureaucratic, and media elites. We've seen that in several states as citizens push to get rid of the Common Core, to protect students from data collection, and to provide testing opt-out protection to parents. And we've seen it in the GOP-controlled Congress that in reauthorizing No Child Left Behind refused to, in my opinion, significantly curtail the federal footprint and in some respects even expanded it. In fact, I think they didn't even make a serious effort, I think, to curtail the federal footprint. On Common Core, I think part of the problem is that politicians, they look around, they realize, okay, there's a problem here with Common Core. People hate Common Core, so they've internalized Common Core bad. Then they say, okay, so what do we need to do about it? Well, let's find out about it. And I think the tendency is to look at the media, what the media reports on Common Core, and then that informs the solution. So what does the media say about Common Core? The media says, well, Common Core is, it's essentially good. The problem is that people are upset because they've lost control over government. And particularly, people are upset in Common Core because there was federal overreach, and that's what's upset. So what do you have to do? The politicians think, well, this is what we have to do, and the other side kind of tells them this. The pro-Common Core side tells them this. What you have to do is you have to take the Common Core, or a rebrand of it, and you run it through your education process, your education system again. Have them sprinkle some holy water on it, change a few words, and then you declare, well, these are now our state standards. These are, as Florida calls them, the Florida Sunshine Standards, which of course opens the door to a lot of jokes, but more importantly, doesn't change anything. Children are still learning according to the slowed down Common Core progression. They are still trapped in a curriculum aligned to standards that prevent teachers from teaching above the standards and result in children being unprepared for university education when they graduate from high school. And that's both with regard to math and English. Sadly, the children who have sort of the best workaround on Common Core are those children from wealthy families in the know. Why? Well, those are families whose parents can afford private tutoring or private schools that don't teach Common Core like the schools that President Obama and Bill Gates send their children to. So that's the process, and this is where the Republican politicians, I think, are falling into a trap. And they're going to end up with, and you look at the presidential race, and there's a pretty clear demarcation between those candidates that were truly fighting Common Core and those who were pro-Common Core or were pretending to have fought Common Core. The people, the Common Core movement is super savvy. When Governor Walker said, oh yeah, I got rid of Common Core, the moms knew that he was lying. And they also had followed him in detail and knew that his getting rid of it and his contributions to the fight amounted to a couple of statements that weren't backed up by legislative fight. So you had the Walkers, the Kasichs, the Jeb Bush, and Christie, who essentially failed. And then on the other side, you had those who have fought Common Core, like Paul and Cruz and Trump. Trump has, I think, in almost every speech for the last year, has mentioned Common Core and has said he's going to get rid of it, and has talked about how crazy it is. And then in kind of attendant to his rise, Rubio. Rubio has issued strong statements against Common Core recently that have correlated with his rise. I have issues with some of his actions. Anyway, that's sort of an overview, but I think this is what's happening, and politicians have to start listening to the people. And the people will tell you, we're upset about, first and foremost, what is in front of our children, the quality of education they're getting, and how that's been affected by Common Core. And we understand there's a federal overreach issue. We understand that this came about because the checks and balances that were supposed to be in place through our constitutional system were evaded. But that quality issue is something that the media never reports on, and so it's sort of the elitist Republican politicians who only listen to the media, don't have faith in the people. Those are the ones who are going to get in trouble, and if they don't buck up and fight, they deserve to be in trouble. And we're talking in particular, Charlie Baker, governor of Massachusetts, said he would get rid of Common Core, and he hasn't done a thing. Doug Ducey in Arizona, same thing. And on the Democrat side, John Bel Edwards in Louisiana, and it looks like Hutchinson from Arkansas. So I think that this is a huge divide. I think that the establishment class is in for a rude awakening. The upheaval that we see in the presidential elections, I think, is now going to visit the governors in office, and I think when that does, it'll be a glorious day for the American experiment. All right, I'll turn it over to Neil.
All right, I'll go fast so we can open question and answer since we only have a short time. So I'm just going to talk quickly about there's a new federal education law called the Every Student Succeeds Act, which you have probably heard has eliminated Common Core. You'll hear lots of things about it. I just want to tell you quickly what it actually is, in particular as it relates to Common Core. I think the first thing that you have to understand is you will hear people, and you have heard people who are running for president, they can't actually get rid of Common Core. The president can't say, we're going to eliminate Common Core. The way we got Common Core was through Race to the Top, which was part of the stimulus. And I said, if you want part of this shot of money, which is not recurring, then you have to adopt Common Core. If you want waivers out of No Child Left Behind, you're really encouraged to use Common Core. That said, there's a flip side to this. So you'll be told the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, it eliminates Common Core. And what it says is, in multiple ways, you can't be required or influenced or coerced or whatever by the federal government to use Common Core. And that's fine as far as it goes. I think most people recognize that most states already, 45, a few dropped out, already adopted it. And so they're not going to, in many cases, get rid of it unless there's a lot of powerful action at the state level. But it's important to know, don't look to Washington to get rid of Common Core because it's sort of out of their purview now. They could do things to push it, and that's what you need to know about ESSA. ESSA talks a lot about getting the federal government out of standards, out of testing, out of accountability. They say it's all up to the state. It does continue to require that you have uniform state standards and you have state tests, and that you in some way hold schools accountable based on those test scores. What you've got to be paying very close attention to, which is very hard for most people, is they're going to write the regulations for this law, and it's the regulations that ultimately say, what can the Department of Education do to states? Can it say, well, we can't tell you what standards to use, but we can tell you we don't like your standards. We can't tell you what tests to use, but we can tell you we don't like your test. And right now, that seems to be what it says, is it says the secretary can't explicitly tell you what to do, but he can keep vetoing your plans as long as he wants and saying you can't get the federal money that everybody else is getting. And Emmett alluded to this. The linchpin for all of this is always the federal money, by the way. But that's very important to understand. So the federal government could still potentially tell states a lot about their standards, their tests, what they have to use, even though explicitly in the law it says you cannot coerce or influence the use of Common Core. So pay very close attention to what's happening at your state, and if you have time, most people don't, but if you have time, pay attention to what's going on with the writing of the regulations for this law, because there are lots of groups already saying we have to set, if you hear the term guardrails, they use the term guardrails to say, okay, well, maybe you don't dictate to anybody, but you got to have guardrails that if any district doesn't do what you like, they hit those guardrails and they get in trouble. So that's important to understand. The next thing is, at your state level, you've probably heard, I've seen a lot of articles lately say, look, for all the bluster and anger over the Common Core, it's really a part of the system now. Everybody has it. And some people tell you it's great. It's too early to say it's great or it's terrible definitively, although the most recent NAEP scores, which is a national test, very slightly suggest maybe it's not working as well as not Common Core. Too early to make any definitive conclusion about that. But also don't believe people when they say, well, we know that Common Core is working. And be very careful when they tell you, we know it's a part of every system. So Emmett talked about, you have people who are telling you, well, we're not on Common Core anymore because they changed the name of it. You need to be very wary of those people. On the other side, people who tell you you've got it, to act like it's here now, don't bother fighting anymore, it's succeeded. The linchpin for all of this is the tests. It's the tests on which your schools are held accountable. It's the tests that really take those standards and make them important for your school and your students. And the reality is we see a lot of states leaving the test consortia that the federal government selected and paid for to create tests aligned to the Common Core. So you may be in a state where they even say, we're keeping the standards, but they've gone to their own test. That test is really the key. Always pay attention to that no matter what people are telling you about the standards. Certainly you don't want people to deceive you and say, no, it's not Common Core. We've called it the not Common Core standards that just happen to be entirely Common Core. But the tests are really the most important part. And then I think it's crucial to understand anytime we're talking about top-down standards and accountability from the federal government, from the state government, even from your district, these are all second and third best solutions for education. The solution for education has got to be school choice. Otherwise, you're imposing one-size-fits-all on people who are going to be different, kids who are going to be different, people with different values, no matter what level it's at. So it's better if it's a district, smaller community, maybe smaller range of problems. But every child is unique, and they need an education that meets their unique needs, and that can only come when we fundamentally change the system from government giving you a school to in some way connecting education funding to the student, letting educators have autonomy to start the kind of school they want, to specialize in the need of unique kids, and then the accountability comes from the parents deciding this school works for my child, I'm going to bring my money to that school, or it doesn't, and I'm going to take it elsewhere. Until we get school choice, we're going to have fights constantly about what is being taught, even if it's at the district level, because all people are different. And with that, I think we have time for maybe 10 minutes of question and answer.
Okay.
You can MC
Go
it.
ahead.
As far as test development goes for the states that have dropped out of the federal program, is it the states that are going to be in charge of test development? Is very difficult. I've been there. So is it the states that are going to do that? Does it have to get approved by the federal government? What are we looking at?
Yeah, it's the states that will do it, and I think it's important to realize that it's not just a matter of getting rid of the federally sponsored test. The state could bring in a test, an off-the-shelf test, or develop its own test that is Common Core aligned. And if that's the case, then you still have Common Core. So it really does get back to the standards. As long as you have a system where you have standards and tests aligned with those standards, well, if you have Common Core standards, then you're going to likely have a Common Core test that's aligned to it. So it is, I mean, you have to have, I think you have to have two things, or three things. You have to have standards that aren't Common Core, because these clearly lock children into an inferior education. You have to have a test that's aligned to those non-Common Core standards. Then I think it's also very important for the state to own the test. So it's not buying an off-the-shelf test that it doesn't own the rights to. Otherwise, it's lost a bit of its control over the education system.
Yeah, you should, though. I think it's sort of instructive. We're nowhere near the solution we want, but there's one of the two consortia is the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, PARCC. They all start out with 26 or so states. PARCC is down to what, 8 states? Yeah, is it 6 now? It's hard to remember because they just keep leaving. And Massachusetts has gotten, well, PARCC has actually started to say, well, you can just use bits of PARCC. We'll let you use some questions and things. And so does that mean that a state that says, well, we're going to use our own test and we're going to take of PARCC what we want, does that mean they've left Common Core? No, it doesn't necessarily. But it could be you'd have a state that says, look, there's some stuff PARCC did that's reasonable. And I'm not prepared to say there aren't things in PARCC or SBAC or even the Common Core that aren't of value. What's important is that your state is truly independently deciding, these are some things we think are of value, here's what we want. And Massachusetts, of any state, shouldn't have gone with Common Core, other than they did for political reasons, it seems to me, because, yeah, okay. Are you from Massachusetts? Absolutely. Okay, so you know. And then the Secretary of Education, whatever his title is there, was big in the Common Core movement. And Massachusetts, most people thought, had maybe the highest standards in the world, or not in the world, sorry, in the country. Although Massachusetts actually does pretty well when you separate them out with the rest of the world. But the point is, so they could be moving in the right direction. They probably did have better standards to begin with. But unfortunately, this requires all parents, all citizens to watch very carefully what your state is doing. And unfortunately, you can't believe what you're often being told is happening. Yes, did you want to add to that?
Well, yes, Massachusetts, we actually, we did accept them in July 2010. Our scores decreased after we accepted them in the nation. Actually, nationwide, the mathematics scores went down for the first time in 25 years. In Massachusetts, we actually have put on ballot initiative where we gathered 80,000 signatures to be on the ballot in November of this year to get rid of it. Also the Department of Education has actually decided to go with an MCAS 2.0, which will be a blend of with PARCC, which we're attempting to oppose as well. But I guess the question I have is, you're talking about the ESSA requiring states to be aligned to having a testing consortium. Since PARCC is...
Yeah, I probably want to clear about it. In fact, ESSA says you can't in any way be required to be part of an interstate consortium. The reality is all the damage had already been done. So ESSA doesn't really change that much because it was race to the top and waivers that did that. But we've got to be clear, we've got to know when we're talking about Common Core that we're definitely saying the right things, which is very hard to know unless you read all this stuff. Otherwise, as a Common Core opponent, you quickly get tarred as being a conspiracy theorist who just doesn't know what's happening. So even the NAEP scores, it's true, the NAEP scores dropped for the first time in a long time, this most recent NAEP, and that's a federal test, but it has some meaning because nobody gets punished for how they do. But we don't know that Common Core caused that. It's maybe suggestive when you break out the states, but we shouldn't say that we know that that's happened. Not that you said that.
Right. But I guess the question is, since PARCC had done so horribly, going from 26 down to 6, and it sounds like there's still going to be some federal oversight of the testing process. How is that going to work if there aren't, smart PARCC and Smarter Balance out there? Because they're not going to go out there and validate the testing processes in 50 states. And if you went from 26 to 6, there's 20 sets of states that are going to be independent in some way, shape, or form. How are they anticipating doing this?
So what the ESSA says is that you're supposed to, as a state, submit your plan to the Secretary of Education. They're supposed to have a peer review. They anoint peer reviewers who are supposed to say whether your plans are good or bad. And the only justification the Secretary is supposed to have is to say, well, if these plans clearly don't make any sense, I can get rid of them. The reality is, we don't know how that would work, but he could very easily say, well, I'm going to say they're no good unless they happen to align with Common Core or something else that I like. But a lot of this is going to have to do with these regulations. So the law says you have to have challenging state standards, but doesn't define what challenging is. If the regulations do, they could say outright,
Well,
it's got to be something just like Common Core.
It does sort of define what challenging standards are, and that definition is pretty much the same definition as Common Core. So but I think the real dynamic is, for the first time ever, you have the federal government making a qualitative, by statute, making a qualitative judgment on standards and assessments. And that's the real dangerous thing that's going on. And I think when you look at the dynamics of how that's going to happen, then it's more troubling, or I would say requires more vigilance. I mean, usually what you have is a conversation going on between the state departments of education and the federal Department of Education. Well, by the time that plan is submitted, I think you should assume that the federal Department of Education is not going to be surprised as to what's in that plan. So I think this is a very dangerous and new dynamic that's out there.
Yeah, and one other thing to remember about this is I'm not actually sure that it defines challenging, but whether it does or it doesn't, what you could very easily see is that for the first few years, the Secretary doesn't do very much.
Right.
To say, I'm going to tell you this is good or no good, because right now, people on the left and the right are tired of the federal government dictating things. But you could see 3 or 4 years down the road when people have forgotten about this, or it's not fresh in their memory, then they say, oh, by the way, you have bad standards and we're going to have to start telling you what to do because your kids aren't doing well.
It could end up being a latent vehicle of power for the Secretary.
Yeah.
It could be a whole 8 years. You could get a president in who's respectful of state sovereignty, and then 8 years from now get a president who's not,
And
or a
that's-
secretary who's not, and that's where.
That's largely what happened with No Child Left Behind. There was a lot, No Child Left Behind right off the bat was terrible. It tells you basically how to structure an education system, but nobody was trying to tell you specifically what standards to use until you got to 2009. So absolutely, this is very important. No matter what it actually says right now, you've got to be constantly vigilant that it won't be sort of corrupted later. I think we've got time for one more. Do you want? Oh, I'll have to let Jason know.
You mentioned that the president can't really kill Common Core. I mean, in theory, could they use federal money to encourage states to essentially kill Common Core completely, or is that not feasible?
Well, I mean, that would be, the big problem with Race to the Top is you had the federal government trying to use a carrot and stick, using a carrot and stick influence to pretty much drive state policy. So you don't want the solution to that to be, well, we're going to use that same method to get rid of Common Core. It'll just be a further insult on state decision-making and local decision-making. What needs to happen is the states have to step up and reclaim control over their education. And that really enabled Race to the Top to be successful. You had this decades history of states, particularly state legislatures, abdicating on education policy making. That can't happen anymore.
So the feds could do that, but it wouldn't be particularly.
Not constitutionally,
Yeah.
but since they've been doing that for that sort of thing for so long, I would be shocked if they said,
Yeah,
here's money if you get rid of Common
could
Core.
they overstep their authority?
Yeah. We've seen a lot of evidence.
There's a lot of precedent on that. But
Yeah, but so I suppose they could do it, but I don't think that's something that's going to happen. Right now, what it says is explicitly Common Core is mentioned in that law as something that you can't influenced states to use, but of course, this is all after the fact, when states were heavily influenced to use.
Right, because, I mean, you look at the federal government says, well, we didn't coerce the states to take up Common Core. So I think that is what actually happens, and what is in the law is very hard to govern and regulate.
I think we got a card in the back that says we have to move along, but will you
We'll be
stick
outside,
around?
yeah.
We'll stick around. Yeah.